Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Surojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Madhupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Kotha Mahamrita Payura Shomuda Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Mudna Nipatyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupo Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambo Jo Radha Madana Mohano Iha Viharati Radha Krishna Kunjadikari Tarubhaya Rasarite Shuddha Siddhanta Dhari Sakala Sujana Geya Krishna Dasa Vidheya Akila Guna Paragunanam Kaviraja Kavinam Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Morachita Jeva Nahi Bujikeva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Chaitanya Charit Krishna Upajibe Priti Janibe Raserariti Shuni Le Borohohit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, nourished by Sri Rup, Sri Sanatan, Sri Raghunath, and Sri Jiva, an exalted songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gauralila, Sri Krishna Das, Kaviraja, Goswami Pad. Again, today we continue our discussion of Caitanya-caritamrta, and we'll pick up from where we left off in our one before discussion, where we discussed the definition of Sadhana-bhakti in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu. So we covered the commentary of Jiva Gosvami, we covered the commentary of Visvanatha Cakravarti. So today we'll look at two payars, which here in Bengali render the gist of that definition of sadhana-bhakti. And we'll look at also how Jiva Gosvami has defined bhakti in the Bhakti Sandarbha, as well as the methodology that's used in both instances of definition, so that we can arrive at a clear understanding of what these payars are saying to convey the meaning of the definition of sadhana bhakti. And then lastly, we'll look at the second of these two payars and address a little bit of how some persons have gone other directions with the meaning of this payar. So what is intended in the context, hopefully by all of this analysis, it'll become self-evident. So without further ado, I'm just going to start from payar 106. So I'm going to cover slightly what I tried to cover last week and got cut off again. So I hope that's all right. So top of the file. In the following two payars, Sriman Mahaprabhu elucidates the meaning of this aforesaid definition of sadhana bhakti. Shravanadi kriyatar sarupa lakshan tatasta lakshane upajaya premadhan. The activities of hearing and so forth are its intrinsic characteristics. in its extrinsic characteristic, the wealth of prema manifests. So as we started to get into last time, we'll look a little bit at the terminology which comes from Nyaya Shastra and the methodology that's being used here. So Vatsyayana defines a characteristic or lakshana in his commentary on Nyaya Sutra as an attribute that distinguishes the nature of a stated object from the nature of all other objects. So, when we have a label for a particular object, there's a reason we label it that and not anything else. So what is that reason? That, simply put, is the lakshana. So, a characteristic, as such, is furthermore of two types, a sarup lakshana, an intrinsic characteristic, or a tatastha lakshana, an extrinsic characteristic. Sriman Mahaprabhu defined these earlier in his teachings to Sri Sanatana Pad as follows. So here in the Caritamrta itself, we find definitions of these terms. Sarup lakshana ar tatastha lakshana, edui lakshanera vastu jane munigan, akriti prakriti, e sarup lakshan, karya dwarai gyan, e tatastha lakshan. Intrinsic characteristics and extrinsic characteristics. The sages, or you could say the wise, understand an object by means of these two types of characteristics. Figure and nature. These are intrinsic characteristics. An object of knowledge acquired by way of an effect of the object to be defined, this is an extrinsic characteristic. So, simply put, the intrinsic characteristic is what is an object made of and how does it appear, or what is its figure. And an extrinsic characteristic is what is the effect that it can produce. So, the significance of this I've given a brief explanation of. To illustrate these definitions, consider that the sarup lakshanas of a copper pot are that the pot's content and shape. The copper pot is made of copper and bears the shape of a pot. These sarup lakshanas distinguish it from pots made of gold, clay, or other materials, and from other items made of copper, such as bracelets, coins, and wires. An example of a tatastha lakshana, in the case of a copper pot, is that a copper pot causes coconut water kept within it to become poisonous. Or in modern language, it leaches copper sulfate into the water as a result of a chemical reaction. Therefore, in Hari Bhakti Vilas, it tells you, don't keep coconut water in a copper vessel, and tells you various other substances that don't get kept in connection with certain metals and so on. This tatastha lakshana distinguishes a copper pot from a pot made of other materials that may often be used to hold coconut water, such as glass, clay, and steel. A copper pot might nevertheless be easy to distinguish from other materials just by its sarup lakshanas. But in some cases, two substances cannot easily be distinguished just by their sarup lakshanas, and thus are distinguished only by their tatastha lakshanas. For example, when two adjacent unlabeled jars in a kitchen are both filled with small white granules, it is only by tasting the granules, that is, experiencing an effect they produce, one of their tatastha lakshanas, that it can be determined which is the salt and which is the sugar. Now you might not have this problem in India so much, because usually the sugar is a bit larger and more clear, but at least in the US, where they have this highly refined sugar, and don't ask what else is in it, because you'll find out it's not vegetarian. The sugar is so refined that it looks like salt. So sometimes maybe you've had the mistake of mistaking the sugar for the salt. So the only way to tell the difference is to see the effect. In other words, the akriti and the prakriti is identical, so you need the acarya, the tatastha lakshana, in order to distinguish. So there's a subhashita about this. The following subhashita similarly demonstrates the utility of tatastha lakshanas using the example of rice and millet. The two have, meaning grow in the same ground, and the two have the same leaves and stalks. The difference between rice and millet is known only by the result, that is, the type of grain the two plants produce. So rice plants, millet plants, if you look in the field and you see them growing, you don't know, is it rice or is it millet? They look almost identical. They have the same stalks, same leaves, in other words, same akriti, same prakriti. You'll find them in the same place. So how do you know which one is which? Well, just wait till they produce grain. And then you'll see which one is the rice and which one is the millet. So this statement, conveys the idea that it's only the tatastha lakshana, or here it says the quote result, meaning the word is fall, and fall, karya in this context are synonymous. The effect or the result that they produce, when you see that, then you can make a distinction between them. So this just gives you some overview of the terminology that's being used. So if we look back at the payar, the Swarup Lakshana of Sadhana-bhakti is activities of hearing and so on. So the act of hearing about Krishna, this is an intrinsic characteristic of Sadhana-bhakti, means it's an act that just by itself is made up of this. And then the extrinsic characteristic of Sadhana-bhakti is that the quote, wealth of prema manifests. So in the case of bhava bhakti or prema bhakti, because prema is already there, then prema is not an effect. So in that way, sadhana bhakti is distinguished from prema bhakti by its tatastha lakshana, meaning the Swarup lakshana is the same. Prem bhaktas, the gopis listen to each other, sing about Krishna. They do shravananga bhakti, so to speak, and so do sadhakas. So the act of singing or the act of hearing might be identical, but the difference between them then is made by the tatastha lakshana. One, in the case of sadhana, when it's going well, then it gives rise to prema. So an act of hearing that gives rise to prema would have been an act of sadhana bhakti. Whereas in the case of prem bhakti, the act of hearing could be considered, or the expression of prema that could be found from a prem bhakta would be what's called in rasa terminology an anubhav, which is also an effect, but in other words, it's an outcome of the bhakti that's otherwise present. It's an outpouring of prema rather than something that's bringing prema into manifestation. So in that way, an identical act of hearing may have the same Swarup lakshana in the case of a prem bhakta and a sadhaka, but then that act of hearing is distinguished by the effect. In other words, in the prem bhakta, it produces the anubhav of, delight or what have you. And in the case, that would be a sanchari bhav, but let's say tears in the eyes. And in the case of a sadhaka, then it will lead to the manifestation of prema within the citta. So this is how the terminology is functioning here. So to get further insight into what's going on, we'll look at how also bhakti in general is defined by Jiva Gosvami in the Bhakti-sandarbha. So Sri Jivapad employs this method of analyzing an object by determining its intrinsic and extrinsic characteristics to elucidate the nature of bhakti in Bhakti-sandarbha. So this is Anucheda 217, I believe. 16, sorry. And a little bit of a long passage, but we'll look at it anyway. Now, bhakti will be defined. Its extrinsic characteristic and intrinsic characteristic are stated as follows in Garuda Puran. Quote, I shall now describe Vishnu Bhakti, by which everything is attained. Hari is not as satisfied by anything else as he can be by bhakti. So having stated this, the text then says, quote, the verbal root bhaj, that is, the verbal root from which the word bhakti is derived, is widely said to mean service. seva. Therefore, the great sadhana known as bhakti is said to be service, seva, by the wise. So now, quoting these two passages, now Jiva Gosvami applies this Nyayayika style analysis. Quote, by which everything is attained, yaya sarvam avyapyate, is the extrinsic characteristic, or tatastha lakshana. That bhakti can cause attainment of any desired object is its extrinsic characteristic. So if we think back, how was an extrinsic characteristic defined? Defined as the effect that the object can produce. So here Jiva Gosvami is saying that, quote, by which everything is attained is indicating the effect bhakti can produce. In other words, bhakti can produce the effect of you attaining anything and everything, whatsoever you desire, essentially. So we can see how the way the tatastha lakshana is defined here in the Caritamrta matches the way Jiva Gosvami is using the term in his analysis of this definition of bhakti. So now we get to some further methodology, which those who study Nyaya are very familiar with, the assessment of how these lakshanas are laid out to see whether they are sufficient to really function as lakshanas, or to actually successfully distinguish this object from all other objects to warrant it having a unique uddeshya, or an unique label. So we'll look at some technical aspect of these three different ways that a definition can fail after we read the passage. So first we'll just see how he applies this type of thinking. So he says, there is an absence of, quote, insufficient pervasion, or avyapti here. That is, there's an absence in the scope of this extrinsic characteristic, because of the conclusion that everything can be attained by bhakti being established in the Bhagavad 2.3.10, quote, whether desirous of everything or desirous of moksha, one of great intelligence should worship the Supreme Purusha with strong bhakti yoga. That is, the scope of this extrinsic characteristic is not too narrow, because this verse affirms that one can attain anything one so desires by way of bhakti. There is an absence of excessive pervasion, ativyapti, in the scope of this extrinsic characteristic, because of it being said in the aforecited verse from Guru Puran, quote, Hari is not as satisfied by anything else as he can be by bhakti. That is, there is no excessive breadth. Sorry, that should need a D. There's no excessive breadth in the scope of this characteristic, because bhakti is distinguished from all other means by which Hari may become satisfied, such as karma and gyan. So, in other words, someone could read the definition and say, oh, Hari is not as satisfied by anything as he is by bhakti. But someone might think here, bhakti is a type of karma, or bhakti is a type of gyan. So then they might find it convoluted to say that and then say, well, then we could do karma, we could do gyan, it doesn't really matter, any of these are fine. So Jiva Gosvami is saying, rather, by specifying that anything else that's distinguishing bhakti from karma and gyan, so thus what's being said about the effect that's being said to be produced by bhakti here is implied to not be produced by karma or gyan. And therefore, the way it's being defined, or this effect that's being mentioned, isn't being spoken of in an excessively vague or broad way. Furthermore, the absence of impossibility, asambhava, in the scope of this extrinsic characteristic is affirmed because of the aforementioned characteristics description in the second aforecited verse from Garuda Puran as, quote, being stated by the wise. So in other words, you might think, well, the first verse that mentioned bhakti mentions an extrinsic characteristic, mentions an intrinsic characteristic, so we got it. Why did Jiva Gosvami bother to quote that second statement as well? So this is why he bothered to quote it, because he wants to negate the scope for anyone arguing that there's, quote, asambhava, or one of the other faults in a definition. So he takes it that because that second statement mentioned that bhajdatu or bhakti means seva, that is the opinion, or that is stated by the wise, implies what? The implication is this, that testimony that conveys the experience of the learned, meaning realized persons, or whom Jiva Gosvami talks about especially in Sarvasangvadini as those possessed of vidvad anubhav, or the perception of those who are realized or who have real knowledge and awareness of things, is accepted as a valid means of acquiring accurate knowledge, or praman. So what you call apta vakya or apta purush vakya, a trustworthy statement of a trustworthy person, in other words, a person who's speaking in accord with the reality. And because such testimony is stated in the aforecited verse, there is no impossibility in regard to the scope of the aforementioned extrinsic characteristic of bhakti. In other words, he's arguing that there's no impossibility because the text affirms that this is the opinion of the vidvan, or this is the perception of the vidvan. So therefore we can't say that it's just, a speculation, or it's just, the opinion of some, so to speak, but rather it's the opinion of those who are of proper understanding, so therefore it's not impossible. So that's the extrinsic characteristic. Now he comes to the intrinsic characteristic. The intrinsic characteristic, or Swarup Lakshana of Bhakti, is stated by the word service, seva. That is, the intrinsic characteristic of Bhakti is service. That service, furthermore, is said to be threefold: bodily, verbal, and mental. Attendance upon Bhagavan. That is, Bhakti means to attend to Bhagavan. That is, to endeavor to personally serve so as to satisfy him with actions of one's body, speech, and mind. Therefore, there is also exclusion from Bhakti's scope of fear, enmity, and so forth in relation to Bhagavan, and of aham grahopasana. That is, worship wherein one takes oneself to be the object of worship. The description of Bhakti as, quote, the great sadhana, sadhana bhuyasi, means that this is the best among sadhanas. That is, that it is superior to karma, jnana, and all other types of sadhana. So his point here is to explain the intrinsic characteristic, and we see in this case where he's defining bhakti and then he's giving a definition of the definition. In other words, if bhakti means seva, and then he's saying, and seva means anugati. And also you can note that at the very end of the Bhakti Sandarbha, in this beautiful statement he makes, Guru Shastram Shraddha Ruchir Anugatir Siddhiriti Me, where he's praying to Radha Krishna and saying that Radha Krishna's lotus feet have appeared to me in the form of my Guru, in the form of the Shraddha that I have, in the form of the Ruchi that I have, in the form of the Anugati that I do, and in the form of the Siddhi that I attain. So he's sort of tying the whole theme of Advaya Gyan Tattva, which he lays out in the first three Sandarbhas through the Varanti Tattva Vidas verse. At the conclusion of the Bhakti Sandarbha, he's then speaking of that Advaya Gyan Tattva as Radha Krishna specifically, and then saying that Radha Krishna specifically are that singular source, which is he sees as coming to him in the form of the Guru, in the form of his Shraddha, his Ruchi, etc. And he uses the word there, Anugati. So, to me, that clearly points to the fact that he's defining the word seva, which is itself defining the word bhakti in this section. So when he defines bhakti, he says bhakti means seva, and when he's defining seva, he says it means anugati. And then in this concluding verse of the Sandarbha, he's speaking about anugati and then siddhi. So the sense would be that anugati there means seva, means bhakti, and that is the means to siddhi. Just, as you read through the way he uses words over the course of the text, you can grasp sort of certain choices or preferences that he makes. And my personal two cents on that is that the word anugati, here I've rendered it as attendance, and literally it can convey the idea of anu, like after or toward, and gati, meaning motion or to go. So to go after, or to follow something, or to go after it, in the sense of to attend to it, or to pay one's attention to it, and then the implication being to then do whatever is required of it, to look after it, so to speak, you might say in colloquial English. Sometimes if a parent is leaving an elder sibling in charge of a younger sibling, they'll say, look after your brother, or look after your sister, or something like that. And the idea is that, that you take care of them, you see to and look to and follow with whatever it is that they require so that they're well. So obviously bhakti is more than looking after your little brother, but the way that we use that word, to me, mirrors the etymology of the sense of the word anugati here, and can convey the idea of, following after, or in other words, that bhakti fundamentally is to consciously attune to the other, and then to act in accord with what is appropriate to the other, or pleasing to the other. And similarly, Sridhar Samipad defines prema. Is it priti or prema? I forget now. But Jiva Gosvami cites it, as those of you who studied the Priti Sandarbha saw, as one of his definitions of priti by saying chit anuvritti, that fundamentally to love the other or to care for the other is to, chit anuvritti, to the same, vritti in this sense to mean to function or to act. So to act after or to act in accord with the mind of the object of love. In other words, to follow along or attend to that. So how bhakti is defined, how seva is defined, how priti is defined, Sridhar Swami uses anuvritti, Jiva Gosvami quotes that, and then here when he's defining bhakti and seva, he's using the word anugati, which to me mirrors also that choice of language of Sridhar Swami, and I think can sort of capture that fundamentally bhakti is not any, although its intrinsic form may be an act of hearing or praising or whatever, but in essence, it's a conscious attention and an act of attendance to the object. So anyway, without further elaboration, that's how he gives the intrinsic characteristic. So to express that going after the other through acts of the body, of the speech, or of the mind, this will be how he defines seva, which itself defines bhakti, or the intrinsic characteristic of bhakti. So then when he says there is also exclusion from bhakti's scope of fear, enmity, and so on, the idea is that if one performs what would be an intrinsic act of bhakti, but the motivation of that is enmity or fear, then that doesn't meet the Sarup Lakshana. As we saw in the definition of Uttama Bhakti, Anukulya is qualifying the Krishna Nushilanam to exclude, for example, Kamsa's Krishna Nushilanam, or Kamsa's constant thought of Krishna, which was driven by fear. So such is sufficient to liberate someone from samsara, but not sufficient to qualify as Uttama Bhakti, or as Bhakti here. So that's what he's alluding to. As well as by mentioning here ahamgrahupasana, he's saying that if one adopts oneself as the object to which that bhakti is directed, then that won't meet this definition of bhakti. So although, as Jiva Gosvami referred to in the Vishnu Puran and other places, it's described that Prahlad Maharaj, at least in some births, extensively practiced aham grahopasana, that itself won't qualify as bhakti, but it can perform the function of chitta shuddhi, whereby one can, with the right sangha, kripa, and so forth, adjust that direction to which the bhakti is focused, and thus Prahlad is also regarded as the greatest of Shuddha Bhaktas in a general sense, as celebrated in the Bhagavatam. So Ahangrahopasana is not so to speak, to be vilified entirely, but nevertheless is excluded from meeting this definition. Okay, sorry, I don't mean to elaborate excessively. So he states these two characteristics of bhakti, namely bhakti's intrinsic and extrinsic characteristics, in another manner in the Bhagavad 11.2.34. In other words, Jiva Gosvami is meticulously trying to make all of his points using praman from the Bhagavatam itself. So although these verses from the Garuda Puran are much more useful for his purpose, he still quotes the statement of the Bhagavatam after he's more or less made his point clear, to keep up his methodology that he can instantiate all the points he wants to make off the Bhagavat itself. So he quotes this verse, quote, "Know those means of realization stated by Bhagavan for unlearned persons, for the sake of their easy attainment of the self. That is, the supreme entity, which is possessed of the appearances of Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, to be Bhagavatas, that is, Bhagavad Dharmas, meaning forms of bhakti to Bhagavan." So know those means of realization of Bhagavan that are stated by Bhagavan to lead to easy attainment, to be Bhagavad Dharmas, or to be acts of bhakti. So then he uses the same methodology to analyze this verse. So here, quote, "stated for the sake of attainment of the self, atma-labdhai prokta, conveys the extrinsic characteristic of bhakti, because such attainment is an effect of bhakti." In other words, extrinsic characteristic means the effect it produces. So what does this say? It says that this is stated for the sake of attainment of the self. So the implication is that Bhagavad Dharma, practicing Bhagavad Dharma, leads to attainment of the self. So the effect of Bhagavad Dharma, or the effect of bhakti, is attainment of the self. This is unerring because of the non-attainment thereof by way of anything else. So this is given here, remember, in 216 of the Bhakti Sandarbha. So he's already done the massive analysis in the early portion of the text to establish bhakti alone is the abhideya, not karma, not gyan. So he's now leveraging that earlier established point at this section later, where he's going more specifically into the nature of bhakti, by saying that there's non-attainment of the Atma by anything else, because he's already determined that karma and gyan alone without bhakti can't lead to that realization. So it is befitting to determine causation of attainment of the self as an extrinsic characteristic of bhakti, because the self is never attained by any means other than bhakti, and thus there is no excessive pervasion or insufficient pervasion in the scope of the definition. The means of realization for the sake of attainment of the self, atmalabdhaya upaya, conveys the intrinsic characteristic, since those means of attainment thereof, that is, of the self, namely, hearing about Bhagavan, praising Bhagavan, remembering Bhagavan, and so forth, are verily forms of attendance or anugati upon him. That is, service to him, and service was established earlier as the intrinsic characteristic of bhakti, which is to say that acts of service, like hearing about Bhagavan, praising Bhagavan, remembering Bhagavan, and so forth, constitute the essential nature of bhakti. Alright, so I hope this point is clear. So now I'm going to just do a little bit of analysis with reference to the basics of Nyaya to explain the methodology that Jiva Gosvami has used here. So in this explanation, Sri Jiva Gosvami employs a further layer of methodology that originates from the discourse of the Indic school of logic known as Nyaya. There, a threefold process is employed to understand the nature of an object. Number 1, uddesha. A name is assigned to an object. 2, lakshana. Characteristics of the object are stated. And 3, pariksha. Examination is done to determine whether the characteristics accurately define the object or not. So this comes from the Vyatsayana's Nyaya Bhashya on the Nyaya Sutra. So he's summarizing the methodology that Gautama uses in the Nyaya Sutra. So uddesha, lakshana, pariksha. So bhakti, and then Sarup Lakshana A, Tatastha Lakshana B. And then what we just did, what this whole analysis that we just read, is called pariksha, where you then analyze those lakshanas and show why is there no ativyapti, why is there no avyapti, etc. So examination of this nature is conducted by assessing whether or not the characteristics are free from three standard types of defects, namely insufficient pervasion, avyapti, excessive pervasion, ativyapti, and impossibility, asambhava. So you saw all of those terms used above. The, quote, insufficient pervasion, or avyapti, is defined as the non-reach of a characteristic to a portion of the object, meaning an instance in which the characteristic fails to sufficiently identify and distinguish the object. An example of this can be observed in a definition of, quote, cowness, or gotva. So this might sound funny, but this is very typical of the way Nyayikas talk, where they don't talk of just a cow, they talk of cowness, or gotva. So any sort of noun, they turn that into an abstract noun. So if there's a cow, then there's this something that makes a cow, and we want to talk about that, the cowness of the cow. So then how do we determine what is, wherever there is cowness, there will be a cow. So we have to clearly set the parameters of cowness, and then anything that we call a cow will be understood properly. So therefore, that's why it sounds a bit funny in English, but this is, actually enables one to be more precise in the way one speaks and in the way that one, establishes the meaning of what one is talking about. So, an example of this defect can be observed in a definition of cowness, or gotvam, that is, of being a cow, as, quote, being possessed of white color, shuklavatvam. This characteristic is too narrow, that is, it has insufficient pervasion, because cows can be possessed of white color, but can also be possessed of colors other than white, such as black or brown. So if you say, what does it mean to be a cow? Well, it means to be white. Well, then you can say, well, then you just excluded all brown cows and black cows from being cows because they're not white. So then if you define being a cow as just having a white color, then your definition doesn't pervade, or it doesn't cover and include everything that actually is a cow. So therefore, it has this defect, which is called avyapti, or insufficient pervasion. The scope of your definition isn't covering what it needs to cover. So then you have the opposite defect. Excessive pervasion is defined as the reach of a characteristic to that which is not the object, meaning an instance in which a characteristic includes objects other than the object being defined. An example of this defect can be observed in a definition of cowness as, quote, shringavatvam, or being possessed of horns. This characteristic is too broad, that is, it has excessive pervasion. Oh gosh, there's a mistake, that should be ativyapti. Because horns can be found on animals other than cows, such as goats and antelopes. So if you say, oh, what does it mean to be a cow? It means to have horns. Well, then everything that has horns is a cow. So then you just turn deers into cows. So that won't do. You've defined it too broadly. And actually, this previous fault of, quote, whiteness, you could say the same thing. If you just define cows as being white, then a white table is also a cow. So that you could also use that as an example of ativyapti as well. Now, the last defect, finally, impossibility, asambhava, is defined as the non-reach of a characteristic to the entirety of the object. In other words, a characteristic might include some of what you're trying to define, but leave out some, or it might include everything you're trying to define and more stuff that you don't actually want to include. And then you might have a definition which just misses the mark altogether. It doesn't get a little or too much of what you want, it just goes off in another direction. So an example of this defect can be observed in the definition of cowness as, quote, single hoofness, or akashafatvam. This characteristic does not describe a cow at all, That is, it has the, defect of impossibility, because cows have split or cloven hooves rather than single solid hooves like horses and donkeys. So some, cows and certain other mammals, their hoofs have a clove in them or they're split, whereas horses, they have one whole circular hoof that goes all the way around. So if someone thought that cows had feet just like horses, and then they said that a characteristic of a cow is single hoofness, then that would be wrong, because cows don't actually have that type of hoof at all. But that is near, so to speak, or it's somewhat near what you would actually want to say. So it's used as an example of impossibility because it's a mistake that someone could possibly be prone to make. So, employing this methodology of establishing characteristics and then examining whether they are free from the aforesaid types of defects, Sri Jiva defines bhakti in the aforecited passage from Bhakti-sandarbha by stating its characteristics by way of citations from Garuda Purana and Srimad Bhagavatam, and then demonstrates why these characteristics are free from the three types of defects that can occur in a characteristic. So, I'm not going to rehash what we read, but by looking at this methodology, and then you reflect on what was stated in the passage, you can see that efficiently he's giving his definition, and then he's going right into precluding arguments as to why there could be avyapti or ativyapti or asambhava in regard to how he's defined it. So he doesn't just sort of go in and list it like an ABC, he just gives it and then says, and it's not deficient in this way, or this way, or this way, meaning therefore it's fine, or therefore I've given it in this way, without having to even say that. It's just implied, because readers who are familiar with this methodology will immediately identify the methodology he's using and immediately pick up on what he's saying, sort of in the genre of literature where you don't have to spell it out all the way. So, like that. So now if we bring this whole analysis back to the payar that we're talking about, we can get a clear sense of what's being said. So, in the payar under discussion, Sriman Mahaprabhu also employs this method of analyzing an object by determining its intrinsic and extrinsic characteristics, to determine the nature of sadhana-bhakti. In doing so, he also elucidates the meaning of the aforecited definition of sadhana-bhakti from Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu 1.2.2. He identifies, quote, the activities of hearing and so forth, shravanadi kriya, as sadhana-bhakti's intrinsic characteristic. This corresponds to the qualifier of sadhana-bhakti in the aforecited definition of kriti sadhya, which indicates that sadhana-bhakti is enacted by actions of the senses. So, if we think about the definition in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu and we think about what's being said here, then the two, kriti sadhya bhavet, sadhya bhava, sacha sadhanabhida. That sadhana is this thing that has these two qualities. It's kriti sadhya and it's sadhya bhava. So then, essentially what this payar is saying is that the intrinsic characteristic, the sarup lakshana, is indicated by kriti sadhya, and the tatastha lakshana is indicated by sadhya bhava. So kriti sadhya, which meant actions of the senses. So broadly speaking, this elliptical designation, quote, the activities of hearing and so forth, shravanadi kriya, can be interpreted to refer to activities of all the senses, beginning with the act of hearing. So in other words, now we're dialing in, what does the adi refer to? So kriya, activities, shravana, hearing, adi, and so on. So what does that and so on refer to? In English, if you look at style guides for writing English, if you use a phrase like, there are many, many nice towns in this state, such as town 1, town 2, and town 3. In English writing, it's considered a fault to use a phrase like such as and not give more than one example. Because it's considered that if you only give one example, it may be ambiguous to the reader what was the line of thought that you had. So you have to give at least 2 to 3 illustrations whenever you use a phrase like such as, or for example, that, in order for it to be clear, the categories that you're speaking of, and then the examples that fit that category. So, with all due respect, there's no such rule in Sanskrit prose, and in so many cases, our acaryas and other commentators, they'll use this type of format, but they'll just give one instance of the category or of the group or the list that they're referring to. So sometimes it can be a challenge to identify what does that adi or what does that etc., what does the rest of the category or what would the other members of the category alluded to by that actually be. And in rarer cases, it can be of significant siddhantic import. So in this case, when we have in this payar Shravanadi Kriya, then the act of Shravana is well known to be one of the 5 standard acts of the senses. In other words, the 5 senses are we can hear, we can see, we can touch, we can taste, we can smell. So does Shravana mean hearing, touching, tasting, and just refer to acts of all the senses in a general way? And hearing is also typically considered the first sense that we have. It's correspondent with the subtlemost element of ether or space or whatever you want to call it, akash. And so it's often the first in the list. So by putting Shravana here, you could think, oh, this points to the list of the 5 standard functions of the senses. However, as we all know, Prahlad Maharaj has famously listed and summarized the process of bhakti with 9 types and gives the first one as Shravana. So for persons who are acquainted with Bhagavatam discourse, then they might think, oh, Shravana and so forth, that means Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, Padasevan, etc., that means that. So when it's written here in the payar, Shravanadi, then are we talking Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, or are we talking Shravan, Darshan, etc., like that? There's some ambiguity, and if we look at how various commentators here on the Caitanya-caritamrta have interpreted it, we find that some give it one way and some give it the other. So I've elected to at least just honor or mention that both such interpretations are given. So, broadly speaking, this elliptical designation, quote, the activities of hearing and so forth, can be interpreted to refer to activities of all the senses beginning with the act of hearing. So, to support that interpretation, I offer the following. Given that Sri Jivapad interprets the word anushilana, which states the intrinsic characteristic of Uttama Bhakti in the general definition thereof, given in Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu 1.1.11, to refer only to action in general, like the word kriya, meaning given that any action at all can be an act of Uttama Bhakti, provided it is also possessed of favorability, or anukulya towards Krishna, it can be understood that the mention of, quote, the activities of hearing and so forth mentioned in the payar under discussion can refer to any activity at all that is also possessed of the second essential characteristic of sadhana-bhakti, namely that such activity is sadhya bhava, meaning it is an action by which bhava can and is to be accomplished, that is, an action the aim of which is bhava. So, if we look at the broadness with which the word anushilana is defined earlier in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, then you could take it that here kriti sadhya, or this whatever is done by actions of the senses, can just mean all actions of all the senses, and because Jiva Gosvami rendered kriti sadhya in his tika that we read last time as just activities of the senses, then you could say, oh, Shravana here just refers to activities of the senses, and it's just very broad like that. So, by Jiva's tika on both this sadhana-bhakti definition and the Uttama Bhakti definition, you could argue for Shravana referring to not specifically hearing of Krishna, but just acts of all the senses in general, which are related to Krishna, which would refer to that, but not exclusively to that, in other words. So, more practically, however, the mention of, quote, the activities of hearing and so forth, in the pyre under discussion, can be understood to refer to acts of what Sri Jiva Pad calls Sarup Siddha Bhakti in Bhakti Sandarbha 2.17. That is, acts of bhakti which are, quote, accomplished, or siddha, meaning determined to be an act of bhakti just by means of their own essential nature. Meaning, acts that by their very nature are acts of bhakti because they pertain directly to the object of bhakti, namely Sri Bhagavan. More simply put, the activities of hearing and so forth can be said to refer to all forms of Sarup Siddha Bhakti, 9 types of which are spoken of by Prahlad Maharaj, namely hearing, praising, remembering, serving the feet, worshipping, offering obeisance, servitude, befriending, and offering the self, and a number of additional forms of which will be discussed or alluded to in this later in this chapter in verses 111 to 114. So here in this verse, in this chapter, we have the whole list of the 64 Bhakti-yangas. So you could also take it that this Shravanadi Kriya refers to all the Bhakti-yangas that we're going to discuss later on in this chapter. So I don't see that it's necessarily wrong to interpret the statement one way or the other, and that you could take it more broadly, and you could also think of it in a more practical sense that for the most part, it's going to refer to acts in this way. So in that way, the adi could be interpreted in either way. So I think we're out of time for today. I'll just read one more paragraph, and then we can get to the next pyre next time. So after stating this intrinsic characteristic of sadhana bhakti, Sriman Mahaprabhu mentions, quote, the wealth of prema manifests, upajai prema dan, with respect to the extrinsic characteristic of sadhana bhakti. Meaning, because sadhana bhakti is instrumental in prema bhakti becoming manifest, prema bhakti is regarded as an effect of sadhana bhakti. And thus, sadhana bhakti's extrinsic characteristic, its effect, is determined to be causality with respect to a manifestation of prema bhakti. This characteristic corresponds to the second qualifier of sadhana bhakti stated in the aforecited definition, sadhya bhava, which indicates that sadhana bhakti is that by which bhava, and more broadly prema, is to be and can be accomplished. So just completing the mapping, so in the definition that we read of sadhana bhakti in the Sindhu, kriti sadhya and sadhya bhava. Kriti sadhya is the sarup lakshan, sadhya bhava is the tatastha lakshan. And that by which bhava is to be accomplished is simply rendered here in prema as by sadhana bhakti, prema bhakti becomes manifest. And kriti sadhya, that it's done by actions of the senses, then here that means by the activities of hearing and so on, using all of your senses, then this is how sadhana bhakti is performed. This is the form of sadhana bhakti, meaning the akriti, meaning the intrinsic characteristic. So in this way, we can see how, using this nyayika methodology, this statement in the Sindhu is made quite vivid by this type of nyayika analysis here in this pyar in the Caritamrta. So then the next pyar deals with the second half of the definition. So just as we discussed in the previous discussion of that definition, that Rupa Gosvami was concerned that there would be ambiguity about this notion of causality or of this sadhyaness that was being alluded to, so he clarifies what is the intended sense of bhava being a sadhya in the second half of the definition. Then just like that, here in the Caritamrta and the next pyar, an analysis is given to elucidate in what sense this idea of manifestation or of production of prema was actually intended. So we're out of time for today, so we can dive into that. And this next pyar is a very well-known statement, so a worthy subject matter of discussion. So we'll dive into that next time. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free to share.
Yeah, Baba.
Yes.
What would be your translation of the word anubhav?
In the context of one of the 5 elements of rasa, or in the context of vidvad anubhav?
No, in the context of rasa.
There's, from what I recall off the top of my head, Rupa Gosvami gives 2 different definitions of it and is kind of tweaking the way it was used by earlier theorists. One simple way of understanding it in ways that he describes it is that it's an effect. In other words, one has the sthayi bhav. In the course of the sthayi bhava becoming manifest, that manifestation produces effects in the form of dancing, singing, etc.
If I were to translate it to a person, to a devotee, ask me what is anubhav?
In that context, you could call it, it's an effect. An anubhava, or like an after state, or an after existent. Sometimes it's also translated as an ensuant. In other words, something that ensues from the primary element.
And in the other perspective, just not in Rasa Shastra, but in would you translate as an experience, as feelings? How would you?
No, not in this case. That would be anubhav. There's 2 words, anubhav and anubhav.
What's the difference?
So one, like today, we talked about vidvad anubhav. So that, in that context, you're talking about experience or perception. But anubhav is more like an after state, and an after, or an ensuant, something that comes about after having. You could say that anubhav comes from anubhav. In other words, you had an experience, and then you're having an effect or an ensuant of that. Like, you're watching the World Cup, and then you see like the goal, and then everyone, rah! It's like you perceived the goal, you had the anubhav, your team scored the goal, and then the anubhav, rah! You're cheering and hugging or crying or whatever you're doing because,
Is there a difference in the spelling?
Yes, one has a long A, one has a without a long A.
Acha. I wasn't aware of it. Yes, so the ordinary translation would be like an experience. In Rasa Shastra, in Rasa discussions, or in this particular discussion, it would be the one with the long A. Anubhav.
Yes.
And otherwise, anubhav is like the ensuing.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. So, if no one else has an urgent question again, I'd like you to clarify again that I'm a little confused about the difference between when sometimes Krishna is described as Vishai, which usually is translated as subject, but Krishna is the object of our love. So can you clarify when do we use, the word subject and when do we use the word object?
Well, the word Vishoy has a wide range of meaning in Sanskrit texts as well as vernacular languages. So when we translate it, usually its meaning or the way we render it will shift according to the context of its usage. So, for example, in the Sindhu, when you're talking rasa terminology, you have the Vishoyavalambana Vibhava as Krishna, who's the object, the support of rasa in the form of the object to which the rati is directed. So in that case, the usage of the word object would, generally speaking, be more appropriate, although if you prefer another word, that I'm not adamant that you have to translate it as object in that case. But in other cases, the word vishoy can also refer to like the subject matter of a discussion. Like oftentimes when, at least in colloquial Bengali, if there's going to be a lecture, then or a sabha or some program or some utsav, then they'll say, oh, what will be the alochanar vishoy, or what will be the vishoy of discussion? So in English, we would typically say, what's the subject matter, or what's the subject of discussion? But you could also say the object of the discussion, and whether it's what's this discussion about. So in that case, the word vishoy, we might, in English, you might say, well, subject and object, these are opposites. But here we're saying the word vishoy, you can translate it as both, but it just depends on the context. In other words, when you're talking about a, quote, subject of discussion, you're talking about the subject that everyone's attention is going to. So in one sense, it's an object, it's a focus that people have. And similarly, in the rasa context, Krishna is the focal point of the bhakta's attention. So in that way, you can see how in another language, an idiom or a word could span both of those usages. It just so happens that in English, we typically use these two different words to speak about those two different things.
Acha, very clear, very clear. Okay, thank you again. Radhe Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Jai Shri Radhe.
Radhe Radhe, I have a question.
Okay.
So you made a very good point about for instance, the hearing and chanting, for instance, of gopis, right? They're hearing and chanting, and that is in prema. They're in prema bhakti. Whereas the sadhakas do the hearing and chanting, but it's out of the stage of sadhana. So I'm just trying to understand, like, because sometimes we hear, like in glorification of one's guru. Yes, my Guru Dev, he's in prema bhakti, but we can clearly see that Guru Dev is acting like a sadhana. So, he's acting like a sadhaka. So sometimes I'm just trying to formulate as I'm speaking, like this idea that my Guru Dev, he's a prema bhakta. Of course, this is a good attitude for a sadhaka, but wouldn't we also say that this is somewhat subjective? Clearly the gopis, right? Clearly Mahaprabhu's parishads, they are in prema bhakti, and they're doing their bhakti out of prema, whereas as a sadhaka, one does it out of sadhana to attain bhav and prema. So how does one, and I'm not so sure if this is even like a legitimate question, but how does one address, like, when something is said of a person due to something, due to some subjectivity, as opposed to something that is an established fact? Like we know that the parishads of Mahaprabhu, they were prema bhaktas. We know that the gopis and the residents of Vraj and even the residents of Dwarka and Mathura, even though their bhakti is mixed with Aishwarya, they're also in prema. So is there some way, I'm just trying to understand if there is a legitimate way of kind of like addressing, like when we hear such statements, if this is like, something subjective, something that you just kind of leave it as it is, or I don't know. I'm trying to raise a question about something that has come up, right, in conversations with bhaktas of today.
Okay. Well, I'll share a few thoughts related to what you said, and you can let me know if I'm getting at what you wanted to bring out. On the one hand, we hear these phrases like Vaishnavera Kriya Mudra Bhujanana Jai, that, the appearance and the activities of Vaishnavas are beyond comprehension. In other words, when and where, who's, filled with prem, or who's crazy, or who's not, or, we don't know. It can be very hard, and it's generally we don't go to judge and say, oh yeah, because of X, Y, and Z, so-and-so is this or that, And so some Vaishnavas, they may become enamored with the character, the expression of some Vaishnavas, and they may perceive that person as a Prem Bhakta, or they may want to see that person as a Prem Bhakta and speak of them as such. And maybe not everyone is inspired to see that person in that way by what they observe, but we want to be very careful not to ever engage in ninda or detraction or things like that. So, how someone wants to perceive someone else is not necessarily something we want to police, so to speak, provided it's not unhealthy or it's not leading to some, dangerous social dynamics for those people. But at the same time, we can say, for example, in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, at the end of the Bhakti Prakaran, then Rupa Gosvami talks about the lakshanas of Bhava Bhakti. He explains many of them what they are. And for example, never wasting time and being fortuitous and having great attachment or taste for chanting the name and great fondness for residing in Braj, all these famous 9 lakshanas. And then he says, but all of these things can be perceived in people who also don't have Bhava Bhakti. And then Jiva Gosvami comes along and says, Tadeka sprihatam eva mukhya lakshanam, that the primary characteristic of Bhava Bhakti is desirousness of him alone. To desire Bhagavan alone, this is the essential characteristic of Bhava Bhakti. So where that is absent, Bhava Bhakti is absent. Where these other externally observable characteristics are present, Bhava Bhakti could be present or could not be present. But desirousness of him alone has to be present. So then he goes into an analysis of what he calls bhava bhas, and where people can show these different semblances of bhav when they actually don't have bhav. So then he gives the example of a mumukshu, in other words, someone who's performing bhakti as a means to attain moksha. In other words, someone whose aim ultimately is not bhakti in Bhagavan, but sayuja mukti, but considers that their absorption in bhakti is a means to that. And then he writes a verse to explain how some mumukshu is hearing this Bhagavat Katha, and he's moved to tears in some moment as he hears this Katha. So then Rupa Goswami describes this as a bhava bhas, because it could look like an anubhav of someone who has great ruchi and so forth, but because the person isn't actually desirous of attaining Bhagavan, it doesn't qualify as an actual symptom of bhav. So similarly, in the Madhurya Kadambini, in various other places, here in the Sindhu, also later on in the Prem Bhakti Prakaran, then you hear about these stages going towards the manifestation of prema and certain characteristics which will be present or absent in people according to the stage and their level of attainment. So from those things, we can get some idea what would be a red flag or a green flag so to speak, in terms of the stage that someone is at. Yet, we want to be very cautious in, passing judgments on anyone or, speaking in a way that could, diminish the adoration that someone has for another unnecessarily or anything like that. So mainly all of those lakshanas, all of that analysis is for self-application so that we ourselves can have some idea where we are on the path and how we can progress and also feel supported as we go through different challenges and understand that they're part of the process too and so on. So, from that section, I've given one example. I think there's 4 types of abhas that Rupa Gosvami analyzes there, and from those type of things, then there is some framework by which to consider these matters, but at the same time it's done with a certain level of recognition that we can't fully even do this analysis. There's another one in the Chaitanya Bhagavat, I think it's Vaishnavara Chini Shakti Devara Nahiti or something like that. Like, even the Devas don't have the ability to recognize the Vaishnava, meaning who and where, what level of Vaishnavata is there. It's very hard to ultimately judge anybody else like that. But at the same time, we have these lakshanas by which we can get some rough idea. So does that relate to what you wanted to discuss?
Yes, I'm good. I'm good with that.
Okay. All right, well, I think we can leave it at that for today. And if we're so blessed, then next week we'll continue our discussion and we'll look at the second half, or the second payar, which analyzes the second half of the definition of sadhana-bhakti. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe.